I just figured I'd give a quick wrap up on the results and discussion components of your papers. So let's take a look very briefly at synthesizing ideas, organizing, and discussing the results of your method. The results and discussion components of your paper have to include the following information: your findings, the evidence of those findings, that's your data, the results, or a product, right? So a product would be more for like an art type of paper. Discussion, analysis, and or evaluation of that evidence or findings. Interpretation of the significance of the results, the product, or the findings. So the significance, why is it important? Why do we care about this? And you can answer that pretty easily by addressing the gap in your research, is a good way to do it, as well as answering your research question. And that brings us to the next bullet: exploration of connections to the original research question or your project goal. And finally, discussion of the implications and limitations of the research or creative work that you put together. Okay, so include the bulleted information above and read your work back while checking it against the rubric rows 4 through 7. I'm going to go over that in a minute again. I'm going to pull it up, and I have that annotated rubric for you that you can download so that you can keep it in mind when you read your work back. Also, we will be adding an abstract. You can actually write the abstract now. There are components to it. The use of an abstract to summarize your inquiry process and overarching conclusions is a good organizational tool. So please see the high-scoring sample papers I put into Schoology that had the abstract, so you can follow those models and see exactly how it's written. This is very important, though. Whatever components are in that abstract have to be in the paper. So the reader will consider the score for effectively using organizational elements, and that'll be row 7, okay? So I thought I'd go over this summary list, and I'm going to pull up the rubric and go over this again with you, okay? So when you finish your results section, I think a good thing for you to do will be to go back from the beginning and read your paper in its entirety. Okay, so you have to have a good general flow for what's going on. And as you're reading your paper back from the beginning, you can also revise as you go. I'm sure you'll catch some grammatical mistakes or sentences that do not make sense at all. Okay, so some of this, of course, will be for when we go through full peer revision review in a couple of weeks after everybody's papers are completely written. Just keep in mind that when you use this rubric, the paper must demonstrate all components of the left column before moving to the next column on the right. In addition, the scores represented on the rubric, readers may also assign a score of 0 to a single row when the paper displays a below minimum level of quality for that row's performance level. All right, so I did go over this in class up here, right? Understanding and analyzing the context, analyzing the argument, evaluating sources and evidence. So rows 1 through 3 actually go to your literature review, okay? So we can go over that again down the road if you want, or if you have questions about it, you can ask me at any time. I'm going to concentrate today on rows 4 through 7 because this is what's important for being able to write a quality results section based on your methodology. Okay, so let's review these rows. So first up is the research design. Okay, and keep in mind that on the left side here, right, these represent the scores. So this column here would be like a low score. Consider this a medium and this a high score, right? And you can see that by the point values that are sort of assigned there. And you can't land in the middle, okay? So that, like, they can't give you 4. All right, it's either this or it's that, or if you have the next stuff over, you're over on the right, okay? So a low scoring paper on research design, the paper only presents a summary of the approach or the method, but it's oversimplified, right? So it just means you identified the method. I did a quantitative research study with a survey. Boom, done. That's low, okay? That doesn't describe anything. All right, the medium score, the paper describes in detail See the difference there, right? A method is described in reasonable detail, that there's some detail about your methods that can be replicated. That would be a medium score. Okay, and then over here, the paper provides a logical rationale by explaining the alignment between the chosen approach, method, or process and the research question project goal, right? And so the annotated part down here is just to explain what this means. A method is described and an explanation is given of why it was chosen and how it is logical and aligned to the inquiry's purpose, okay? So that's all part of the research design. And I actually created, another document for this. And so I'm just going to go over this quickly as you're reading through your papers. And I will also post this in Schoology. All right, the rationale and limitations for a chosen method. Explaining the limitations of your research and justifying the choices you made during the inquiry process demonstrates the command you had over your research. You should provide the following level of detail about your methodology, your inquiry process. An elaboration of rationale for proposed research design appropriateness to the study. This means you should not simply list and describe the research design. You should be providing an explanation for why you did what you did. You should have a discussion of why the selected method was chosen instead of another method. For example, why you chose a quantitative method over a qualitative. For survey people, you need to discuss the exploratory nature of the research and the trends possible for you to see with your chosen sample. You need to elaborate on why the proposed design will accomplish the study goals and why that design is the optimum choice for this specific research that you did. And the rationale should point towards limitations of your chosen study as to what conclusions can be made from it. Okay, so the 4 and 5 rated sample papers that I have up there for you from previous students are great examples of these methodology sections. You'll find the elaboration of rationale and the explanations of the selected methods and how it will answer the research question and limitations to the chosen study in each of them. So I implore you to pull those papers up and have a good look. Those are actual PatMed students that did that work. Okay. So that brings us back to the rubric, and that should help you with this section. We're shooting for this. We're going for the high. There's no reason that you can't do it. Okay, so that's for row 4. All right, when we get to row 5 on the rubric, okay, establishing the argument, I'm going to start over here on the high section, right? The paper acknowledges the limits and implications of the conclusion within the topic's larger field of knowledge, right? So that means you presented an argument, you've got a conclusion or a new understanding that acknowledges and explains the complications and implications in context of what you did and the research question that you have. That new understanding is so important. It comes from addressing the gap in your research that you presented in the literature review, and it answers your research question, okay? So you should all be over here. If it's medium, it means you presented an argument or conclusion or a new understanding that the paper justifies. Between evidence and claims, there's some description of the links between the evidence that lead to a new understanding. But note, right, like there's a description of the links, but you're not acknowledging and explaining the consequences of that, right? So that's why it's only medium. So if you look at some of the sample papers that were 3s, they'll fall in this range. All right, and if you just offer a simplistic conclusion with unsupported claims and you're not using the data that you collected to actually support your claims, you have to, I see this often in science labs, and it actually drives me nuts, where a student will write a conclusion that just says, the data showed that it supported my hypothesis, period. Well, what data? You have to include that. You have to refer back to it, okay? And that's far too simplistic. So you don't want to be doing that in your paper. Take the time to write and explain and use that data, pull it back in, okay? All right, for row 6, selecting and using evidence, we're going to come over to the high column. The paper demonstrates a compelling argument through effective interpretation and synthesis of that evidence. That's just what I was talking about here. If you're going to establish a solid argument, and you're going to support your hypothesis or reject your hypothesis, it has to be based on the evidence that you collected, not what you want to see. Okay, so in addition to significant and relevant evidence, there are explanations of the relevance and significance of certain pieces of evidence that you collected over others in support of your conclusion. That's really important. Okay, so that's what we're shooting for here. And if you look at the 5 papers that I put up for you, you're going to see that. Okay, they're explaining the relevance and significance of the evidence in context. Okay, for a medium paper, evidence for the conclusion is sufficient and relevant. However, some examples are presented as discrete items without a description of the significance of one item of evidence over another. It means you probably just listed your results, but you really didn't explain what they meant too well. Okay, and then over here, you presented evidence, but it's insufficient, irrelevant, and inconsistent with its conclusion. And it's usually not interpreted at all. So, like, do not be down here. There's no reason for anybody to be down here in this low column. All right, and then finally, we've got 7, engaging the audience. Organizational and design elements engage the audience. They effectively emphasize the paper's message and demonstrate the credibility of you, the writer, right? So the organizational and design elements engage the reader and demonstrate the credibility of the author. This is appropriate placement of tables, appropriate formatting of figures when you add them in, and an explanation of that. So I just pulled up a paper the other day, and the results section started out with a table with no introduction to it. You have to explain to the reader what they're looking at in the table. You can't just throw a table in and expect anybody to understand what it is that you're doing. So you must introduce that table that establishes the significance and the relevance. The data is in the table, and then underneath the table, you give a brief interpretation of the data underneath it. Okay, so please go see the 4 and 5 papers that actually accomplish this, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so a medium score on engaging the audience is that organizational and design elements are present, right? Like you put in a figure, and they neither distract or they engage the reader. It's like, okay, here's this figure, so what? Okay, and then down here, they're present, but like you're unable to follow the message within the reading, and that's just what I was talking about. Like you threw in lines of text that had all these percentages that you found, and there's absolutely no introduction to it, and there's no interpretation, even simply for what it means. Okay, so that's rows through 4 through 7. So these are the things that you want to keep in mind when you're writing your results section. Okay, as far as the conventions down here, I'll be doing this in a little separate mini lesson, especially when we go to complete your final papers in the next couple of weeks. All right, so I hope that's helpful, these rubrics and both of the documents that I just showed before, the rationale and limitations for chosen methods and synthesizing your ideas, are all downloadable in the Schoology folder. Okay, as always, please ask me any questions that you need to. I'm here to help you. All right, have a great day, everyone.